Yeah.
Thank you very much, Volodymyr, for your conference, and let's see the questions. Bogdan. Bogdan,
thank you very much.
Suceava, he is living in the United States. He is a physician, but also a writer. A mathematician, sorry.
Yeah, thank you. So thank you very much, Volodymyr, for this presentation. I'm really impressed, and let me tell you that when you said poetry of life despite death, that's one of the best things I heard in a while. So thank you for that. And I would like to say that perhaps for intellectual engagé in English would work like a socially conscious thinker. I don't know if a native speaker would agree with me, but it's about there. It's about there. And the only question I have is this. How is it for children, for very young people, to grow up today in Ukraine?
Thank you very much for your warm words. And on intellectual engagé, I would like to stress it's not only the conscious thinker, it's an active citizen. And it's also a very important element. So it's interesting dynamics, because when I go to Western Europe, to Germany or France, sometimes I have the impression that when societies have strong states, welfare states, who care about them, it sometimes might produce weak citizens who are feeling that, okay, but there is always somebody who will care about me. I'm not saying it's always like that, but sometimes I have this feeling that there is a danger of doing that. In Ukraine, you have the reverse. It's also, it doesn't mean that it always works like that, but you have this weak state, which kind of imposes greater feeling of responsibility on active part of the population. And therefore, I think intellectual engagé would mean not only conscious or critical thinking or public, but also active, physically active, doing some very physical things, not only metaphysical things. On kids, so I have 3 children, 3 daughters, 17 years old, almost 10 years old, and almost 8 years old. So basically 9 and 7, but they will soon turn 10 and 8. And so of course every child has its own her own dynamics, because on my elder daughter, the full-scale war has started when she had a puberty period with quite as any puberty period is, of course, having certain particular elements and certain complications. And I think the war has given her more focus. So she became more focused. She became more conscious about who she is and in what country she's living and what community she's part of. And this is one element. Our 2 younger daughters, so you can imagine that, for example, they have 10 and 8. That means that they never lived in a situation when there is no war, because the war has started in 2014. But since 14 until 22, it was not present that much in Kyiv. It was in eastern Ukraine. So, but I mean, now it's present in daily life. So the explosions are present, the drones flying over our heads are present. We see all the time the funeral processions. In every city we have kind of a memorials that, and we go to these memorials, and with my daughters we kind of go through them, and I say, okay, let's look at the faces of those people, because they died for their community, for their nation. So it's of course very present. At the same time, I would not say that it is kind of a, this idea of traumatizing experience. I don't know. I'm not sure that this experience will be is traumatizing for them. It's something else. I don't like this term trauma. I think trauma is something. It's a bad word. I don't know why. But sometimes the war, they integrate the war into the childish world, which is the world of games, which is the world of play. Sometimes it's interesting how they take some messages that they hear at school or somewhere else. And sometimes it's a metaphysical conversation. Like my younger daughter, who is 7 years old, who will turn 8 years old, and she's the most philosophical of the three. So she already told us that she wants to be a writer. She writes her own stories. She reads a lot of books at her very young age. She's always reading, and she asks me metaphysical questions like, if God is good, he created people who are good. Why he created Putin? And then she says, so maybe Putin was not good at the very bad from the very beginning. Maybe she was good. He was good, and then he turned bad. So it's a very kind of a serious conversations. And I remember sitting in one of the cafe in Brovary in 2022 and having teenagers at the next table, like children 12 years old, 13 years old, really very, very young, who were discussing who will be the next chief of NATO and why Americans are not that decisive. So the very geopolitical conversations, and certainly they are probably reflecting what they heard from their parents, but this is also the way how they reflect. And recently we went to Kherson. Kherson is a city which was occupied by the Russians. Lots of torture chambers, 8 months of occupation. Then Ukrainians liberated it in November 22. But the Russians are on the other side of Dnipro River. So Kherson is under constant attack. You hear always hear some explosions. There is this term of human safari, which was introduced recently, which means that there are drones flying over you, and they're really targeting and chasing civilians and soldiers. So it's kind of a real chasing. But there are kids there, and we went to the children library, and we brought children writers with us. And one of them, Ivan Andrusiak, said, after talking with children of Kherson, he said, well, these kids have more mature eyes. They're more adult eyes than the same kids in other regions. But other regions are also, there is no region which is safe, basically, in Ukraine. Everywhere Russians are sending missiles to Western Ukrainian cities, or to Odessa, or to Lviv. So basically you cannot say that you're kind of exempt from the war. But of course, the closer you are to the front line, the more dangerous it is. Because in Lviv, there are only missiles, maybe drones sometimes. But if you're living in Kherson, is everything, is artillery, is drones, is snipers, and everything. So it's like that. We don't know. And another problem is that imagine a kid who is living in the frontline city, and this kid, for example, was born in 2015, and in 2020 the COVID started, so no kindergarten, no school, and then the war has started, and then now we have these electricity cuts. So this kid who is now 11 years old, for example, right, or who is going to this puberty time, he or she would probably never had an experience of being within a community. It was always an experience of online, and you can understand that this will become different kids with different emotional system, probably. And for example, my students at Kyiv Mohyla Academy will mostly have online teaching, and for the younger years, we have physical teaching. But now there is these shortages of electricity and heating, and even for younger years, like I have a course at third year, and they said, okay, but it's online, unfortunately. And these kids suffer. They want physical communication. They want to be in a room with other students and with teachers. So it's also this aspect of communication, aspect of emotion connection, which is important. And of course, there are kids who were kidnapped. There are kids. Ukraine says that it's about 20,000 kids who were kidnapped, who were somewhere in Russia, who were adopted by Russian families, or who are. And I can tell you the stories how they were kidnapped. For example, in Kherson, during the occupation, the authorities, Russian occupation authorities, told to parents, okay, you need to give your kid to the recreation camp because it's dangerous and blah, blah, blah. So they were kind of forced to invited to give their kids to recreation camps. Recreation camps are in Crimea, occupied Crimea. And then parents are on one side and their kids are on occupied territories, and there is no connection between them. And so there can be this, for example, stories. There are kids like that. There are kids who lost their parents. There are kids who lost their limbs. There are lots of these stories,
Mm-hmm. Okay. Some other questions, please. I wanted to ask you about poetry, Volodymyr, because I'm really involved now with poetry, publishing a book of Oksana Stomina. We met in 2024, but it's not just a poetical friendship, that's for sure. It's a human friendship, and a deep human friendship, because I understood through Oksana Stomina that poetry for her means to be on the front. She's writing poetry like being a soldier, but her poetry is not, how to say, hard or heavy metal or something. It's very tender. It's a tender poetry, and I'm curious, but also because here are a lot of writers and translators. I have the chance I will have the chance to publish this book of Oksana Stomina because my colleague from Ukrainian department at the Faculty of Letters, Mihaela Herbil, she dedicated for free to translate the book of Oksana Stomina. And as far as I understood from you, I heard also your conference in Krakow. Why poetry is closer humanly to the Ukrainian today than prose, for example, or fiction? Because it's clear that poetry, it's something, it's received, it's perceived like something more intense, more alive in a way that that to write prose. I don't know if it's like this. It's a question for you. I don't know. It's only my sensation, my perception about, but.
Well, I think, yeah, it's very, very good that you translate Stomina, and big thank you for that. I think that prose creates an alternative world.
Mm-hmm.
Even if it's not a kind of a magic realism or fantasy prose, even if it's very realistic prose, it still creates a world apart with its characters, with its kind of a perfume, with its ambience. So it's a kind of another life, and you can recognize yourself in this life, but it's still another life. While I think poetry in today's case, it's a very interesting thing. It's not about imagination. It's about reality. It's about documenting something. I think our poets, and I came across this phrase when I remember talking about Victoria once, Amelina, like her poetry is a documentary poetry because she documents something, and then something that she cannot feel into into just legal report, because documenting war crimes is a legal procedure. You need to be very precise and abide to certain rules. But there is something else to document. There are feelings to document. There are intuitions to document. There are personalities to document. And I think this goes to poetry. So I think in poetry you have, and it's also very important that in Ukraine, in the current Ukraine, poetry is oral. It's present orally. So people, of course, write books, publish books, read books. But the way how we engage with poets is mostly physical presence. So what we do at PEN Ukraine, we connect poetry with music. We have philosophers in Kyiv, including myself, who are musicians. We have kind of this, what we call jam group, philosophic jazz, Kyiv philosophy band. And we accompany poets, sometimes prose writers, but mostly poets. And our space is always full. People come to listen to poets. There are several big festivals. For example, there is a big festival in Lviv, which is called the Land of Poets, Zemlya Poetiev, where you can have a poet, and there are kind of 500 people in the room, right? Or maybe 200 people. Of course, we have phenomenal writers like Serhiy Zhadan, who can get a stadium, who kind of is a rock star. But other poets, maybe they're not that famous, but still, it's if you have a poetry festival, you have huge crowd of people, because I think people kind of look this co-feeling. They look for words that will express what they feel. And this understanding of emotional community, of emotional solidarity, of not only thinking together, but feeling together, I think this is what poetry does.
Florin, do you have a question? Okay, please.
I do have a question, but first, thank you very much for sharing all this. This is really generous, and maybe I dare to say that I understand a little bit better this type of resistance, and I'm sure, I don't know how, because I don't trust all this Game of Thrones that's happening in the international environment. But I'm sure this will lead, this attitude that you have shared tonight will lead to a positive outcome. So my first question was more like a reflection. What do you think, how do you feel about the international community? Not only artistic or literary, but the international community in general. How do you feel about that? Do you feel it is supportive or understanding, or somehow something else? And the second question was how this period changed, if it ever did, your view, your perspective towards philosophy and literature, not necessarily in the time of crisis, but your views in general. Because I assume, like everybody else, you had some sources of inspiration, some projects before all that. How did all this change? Thank you very much.
Thank you for these questions. So international community is very diverse, and with different groups, of course, with different countries, we have different conversation, right? So Europe, let's take Europe. Of course, the feeling that you have as a Ukrainian in Lithuania and the feeling that you have in Switzerland will be different. Unfortunately, I've not yet visited Romania, but I hope I will be soon. So every country is different in this way, because there are also the context of historical context. Somebody understands what Russia is, somebody does not understand what Russia is, etc. What I feel about Europe is that Europe is helping a lot to Ukraine. I mean, believe me that if there is no European support, Ukraine will be in a much more difficult situation. Even if you take economics, because economics is the foundation, the big part of the Ukrainian budget is covered with the European help. So we need to appreciate that, you know. And when, for example, Ukrainians criticize European Union, or when pro-Ukrainian, you know, activists criticize their own governments, we should do that, because I think this engagement is not sufficient. But we need to also to appreciate what is going on. We need to appreciate this engagement. We need to appreciate how European Union is more or less open to Ukraine and very, very helpful. And especially we see that in the current situation with America. So America showed itself as a very unreliable partner. And we will see what will happen next. But I also have a feeling that in Europe, I rather feel a feeling of compassion rather than a feeling of engagement. So people would say, oh, you're brave Ukrainians, you fight so much, and how courageous you are. But people will not say, this is our war, we understand the challenges, this is the war against our European way of life, and we need to engage together. So you will see this feeling in let's say, Lithuania, because Lithuanians understand that if Ukraine falls, they will be next. But you not necessarily have this feeling in Spain, right? I think it's important that Europeans understand more that this is not a Ukraine war. I'm very critical of this concept, Ukraine war. First, it's not only war on Ukrainian territory. Ukrainians are fighting Russian, you know, oil refineries in a very efficient way. So it's a Russian-Ukrainian war. But basically, why Russia makes this war against Ukraine? Because it's more general. It's a war against Europe. It's Russian revenge for the end of the Cold War, for its defeat in the Cold War. Its ambition to divide Europe again. And here, of course, Central and Eastern Europe are in a big danger. When I'm saying that, for example, do not consider this war for Donbass, or that Putin will stop on Donbass. For Putin, there are several key characters in the Russian history who are his kind of role models. For example, Lenin is not one of them. He criticizes Lenin for creating the Soviet Union. Why? Because he thinks that Soviet Union was kind of a confederation, which was a retreat from the model of empire. In Russian Empire in the 19th century, you didn't have any republics like Ukrainian or Georgian or Belarusian or any others. So Putin wants to come back to the 19th century, not to the 20th century. And here, for example, Stalin for him is a much more important role model, because Stalin was undoing many things that Lenin was doing. Right? It's not that I'm a fan of Lenin. I hate this personality because he was also very violent, and there is a connection between Leninism and Stalinism. But at least Lenin was thinking about confederation, and Stalin was thinking how to undo this confederation and make a Russian empire again. And other figures for Putin who are very important are Peter I and Catherine II, because these two people got the access to the seas. So the big Russian geopolitical strategy is to return to the seas, to the Baltic Sea and to the Black Sea. And they want a concept probably intermarium, which connects the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea, which is very interesting concept starting from the medieval times, and connecting these two big things, and the Northern Europe and the Southern Europe. So, and of course, it's connected with the Polish history, Lithuanian history, Ukrainian history, Romanian history, and So Moldovan history, and one of the ambitions of Putin is to get this intermarium back. Now he has Belarus as a puppet state. He wants to have Ukraine, and then he, of course, wants to regain the Baltic states and then control the Black Sea. And this is where the things become dangerous for you, right? Because why he needs, for example, Black Sea or Baltic Sea? Because now you see that Europeans are very undecisive with regards to Russian fleet, oil fleet. But when, for example, Europeans decide to cut the Baltic Sea, then at least 1/3 of Russian oil exports goes away. And oil exports are the major resource of Russian budget and therefore of military budget. Therefore, they think that they are locked in the north and in the south, and they will think how to unlock it. And therefore, it's not about Donbass, it's not about some Ukrainian villages. It's a much bigger story. So I'm trying to explain to Europeans this story. I'm also trying to explain that if Russia attacks one of the NATO members, Lithuania or Estonia, and gets a few villages, just a few villages, and NATO members or EU will be very slow to react, that will be the end of EU, because it will mean that EU is unable to defend its sovereign territory. And Russia, it's not evident when Russia can attack, for example, a NATO member state. Is it after Ukraine falls, or rather it's instead of Ukraine? Because I have a feeling that European Union is much less militarily protected than Ukraine. So, and we have seen already lots of these examples, how Russia is testing with its drones, with its airplanes, etc. Because Russian big ambition is to go inside Europe as far as... Russian big ambition is to re-imperialize the world, to bring empires back. And here they are on the same terms with Trump. These guys want the world to be divided between great powers who will not care about small powers or middle powers. The European model is to have the federation of the middle powers, or small powers. And this is why Ukrainians want to EU, because this was the part of our thinking about history in the past several centuries. So international community is, is kind of with Europe is like appreciation, but at the same time the message that it's not about compassion. It's not that we are victims and you need to have compassion for us. We don't want to die first. We don't want anybody else just to say, oh, these Ukrainians existed, they don't exist no more, let's have a commemoration day once a year for them. It's not what we want. We want to defend us, and we are saying that Europe is also in danger because it's a much bigger picture. With America, it depends with whom you talk. And the language to the progressive, to the left, American left, and to the language with the American conservatives should be very, very different. We see that American public opinion is mostly pro-Ukrainian, but Trump, you see his policy. With the non-Western world, it becomes tricky, or with the so-called global majority or global South. It depends on each particular nation. It's very difficult to talk with Indians. It's quite difficult to talk with different nations in Africa. It's easier to talk with Latin America. It's in Asia. It's easier to talk with, in my impression, but maybe I'm wrong, with Philippines or Indonesia because of the Chinese threat. So it really depends on the region, on the country, on the experience, and etc. Okay. On philosophy, I think I rethought many things, and I really see that philosophy is needed, is necessary, because It provides you with lots of things. It provides you with concepts to rethink the reality. It provides you with a certain balance with this. Well, philosophy is a friendship with wisdom. So I think it's very useful for life to be a friend with wisdom. I'm also quite critical. I became quite critical with certain concepts of like Western European philosophical canon. And in this book that I mentioned to you, Life at the Edge, at certain moments we enter into conversations with some of the concepts. And I think it's important when you're living in these times, which are the times of at the edge, when your life can be over tomorrow. You find this point where you have the source of thinking, because I think every culture starts from the thinking about how fragile we are. I think culture is not born when you're comfortable. I think culture is born when you feel pain, or when you feel uncomfort, when you feel injustice. I think this is where art and culture and thinking starts. This is, at least, it doesn't mean that we don't need to strive for comfort and pleasure, but we also need to cherish these moments and those cultures that are living in these moments. And therefore, for example, if you take a French culture, French literature, which I know better than some others, of course, I will rather read Pascal than I will read some optimists, or I will rather read Camus than I will read Sartre. I would put it that way.
Okay, there is also another question. Mihai Vacariu, please, Mihai.
Magda should go first.
Okay, I didn't see. Magda, please.
Do you hear me?
Yeah?
Good evening, Volodymyr. We met last year in Krakow at the Congress of PEN International, and I really appreciated your lecture, as Ruxanda also mentioned, and I was impressed by your calmness, your detachment in a way of what you were talking about. And it was a lesson for me, because I couldn't imagine that people like you and Ukrainians in general can have a normal life because of the war. I mean, in spite of the war, or despite of the war, as you said. So I have two questions. One, how do you manage to solve these tensions and these difficulties and dangers? And the second question, since we are at the PEN meeting here, do you think PEN International can be useful in this situation? In which way can you use it? And did you have already a good experience with PEN International as a global web of literary person today?
Yeah, thank you. So on my calmness, well, this is what I am. I mean, some people find it very annoying, and it doesn't mean that all the Ukrainians are like that. It depends on your situation. It depends on you cannot find an average Ukrainian. Every Ukrainian has a very specific experience. You can have people who lost their family members. You can have people who are without hands. You can have people who lost their homes. And when I talk to you as a Ukrainian, I'm a Ukrainian. I'm not the Ukrainian. So the war is very diverse. And if you want to learn about Ukrainian experience, try to listen to as many Ukrainians as you can. Do not think that me or somebody else will represent the Ukrainian experience in the only possible way. So some people are calm, some people are very emotional, and and traumatized and even aggressive. But generally, I do feel that Ukrainians remain quite, despite all that, quite, how to say it, quite optimistic. I don't know why. There are lots of I see the lots of like situations when there are electricity cuts. You enter the street and there are lots of generators. So the small shops, they put to the street their gasoline generator, and it becomes very noisy. And people are not upset about it. People are laughing, people are joking, there are lots of jokes in Ukraine, there are lots of humor, lots of dark humor sometimes. Maybe this is the way how to cope with this, you know. This is, therefore, I use this formula, life despite death, because I think that this capacity of living despite something, in spite of something, is kind of a proof that you have the strength of life that is able to overcome the difficulties. And the PEN International were very in a good contact, and they asked me now to write an essay for the anniversary of the invasion. I will do that. Of course, we are kind of in a different kind of, I think, feeling about certain things, because PEN International is mostly about how to protect individual voices against the oppression of power. While in our case, it's not only about individual voices, it's about the voice of a community. And the power which tries to oppress us is outside. It tries to oppress not individual writers, it tries to oppress the whole nation, or kill or exterminate. So, and it creates certain different approach to it. And therefore, my point is that before protecting speech, freedom of speech, we need to protect people who have freedom of speech. There is no free speech without free people. So in our case, in PEN Ukraine, it's more focused not on free speech, but on life, on the survival, on the capacity of life, of commemoration is a part of this thing, because we try to make these writers or cultural figures who were killed as a kind of a living voices. It's also life despite death, or life after life, you know, how to make these people a living voices, not the voices that we just, you know, put a monument to. And you know, so in our case, it's this physicality of the word, it's this kind of a biological, philosophical presence of literature is also important, not only the just a free speech. But these are nuances. We are more or less, I think these are details how these values can be interpreted. But I think that, I mean, we feel lots of support from PEN International and from many, many other local PEN centers, including yours, and lots of others, frankly. And there are people, we organize, by the way, the visits of other PEN centers, and last year we had quite a big number of representatives, I think up to 10. So we keep on communicating with them, of course.
Okay. Mihai Vakareu, please, Mihai.
Hello, Volodymyr. Thank you for being with us tonight. I teach communications at the University of Bucharest, and I used to teach philosophy, but nobody needs philosophy anymore. But anyway, so in 2024, I came twice to Kiev, and we went first time with a friend of mine, an Australian who lives in Brasov, and he teaches leadership and crisis. So he called me a few weeks ago. He said, let's go again to Kiev. And I said, you know, I don't know if I can leave the university, you know, all these bombings, the expenses and everything. And he said one sentence: we have to show support and compassion. So that convinced me. So on Monday, I will be in Kiev again, this Monday. So my first quick question, can we have a glass of wine together in Kiev next week? And second question, Christopher had a very interesting experiment when he taught at the University Faculty of Economics in Kiev. He gave a question to the students, and he said, describe yourself with keywords before the war, how you was before the war. And they put some keywords that describe themselves. And the most words were something like this: depressed, unfocused, disoriented, without a name, and things like that. And then in the section with during the war, now in 2024, the words were determined, focused, resilient, with a sense of purpose, and the most value that appeared there was freedom. So they were valuing a lot more freedom than before. So my question is, I understand, and everyone understands, that the war changed the identity of the entire population, of course, but is it going to be like this for long, or it might, like in communication, when you press with a message, it has impact, and after a while it fades, the impact. Is there any danger that the people not to be resilient anymore? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, of course, we'll be happy to meet. So we'll ask Roxandra to exchange my email. On philosophy is very on demand in Ukraine. I mean, I get and some other public philosophers in Ukraine, we are very, very on demand, and sometimes we cannot. Why? Because people have a lot of questions, existential questions, and we do not have answers to all those questions, but people have questions, you know. And I think this is also the times of crisis when people are trying to find answers to their questions. And I always joke on this, that philosophy is not about finding answers to all the questions, but finding questions to all the answers. And people seem to be unhappy with this answer.
That's why I come to Kiev.
Yes. So I think this research is very, very interesting, and I do find also people who are like that. So when you think about how the war transforms people, sometimes it destroys them, of course. It destroys lives, but sometimes it creates characters. And I know, and some other people told me the stories that they know about people who didn't find any kind of sense or meaning of life before that, but who found them in a particular task in the army or in a particular volunteering work. So I do think that, because what is sense in Latin, right? It's that a direction. So when people get the understanding, the direction where they might be moving, it reassures. Whether it will hold, well, we don't know. Most probably not. And I think that if as I'm teaching the political philosophy, I see this, how the wise men of the past were seeing and understanding when democracy fails, when democracy goes in crisis. Starting from the ancient Greek philosophers up until Montesquieu, you have the same thought that democracy goes in crisis. The values, when the people no longer perceive the basic values of democracy as something that you need to defend, when people perceive these values as inherited and therefore something like natural, something that will always exist and therefore do not need protection, when you feel like that, democracy goes into crisis. So therefore, it's quite often when you say, when we see societies that win the war but lose the peace, sometimes it happens, and therefore I believe that there is nothing irreversible in history. And Ukrainians, frankly speaking, we should not idealize Ukrainians. You know, Ukrainians are as any other people on earth. So we can be mobilized sometimes, we can be demobilized, and of course it's also a big danger. So far we are still very, very mobilized, and frankly speaking, if the Russian intention with this attack on Ukrainian energy system is to demotivate Ukrainians to think that Russians fail. If their attempt is to, if their goal is to make us freeze, yeah, they're reaching their goal right now. That's true.
Okay, we have two more questions. Ovidiu Manelescu and Florin Halalau. Please, Ovidiu, please.
Florin was the first one. Please, Florin.
Okay.
Thank you.
I didn't see. I can't
Yes.
see. I don't have the order. Okay, Florin then. Florin, we didn't hear you. No? Try now, Florin. No? We can hear you. I don't know what's happening. You have the microphone closed. It's not open, Florin. Until then, maybe Ovidiu, you can speak, and Florin, we will speak later. Okay?
Okay.
Please.
Okay. Thank you for your talk and for your time today, Volodymyr. I'll be short. I have two questions. In times like this, when force, not legitimate power, is becoming an accepted argument, again, related to your idea of community, what duty do writers have? This is the first question. And what they can do in practice to keep violence from becoming the new normal.
Well, I don't know. I don't think that I can define duties for writers, especially in the position of PEN Ukraine president, because we are a very democratic institution. But I think this concept of empathy that I mentioned is very important. I think that this might be a big task of literature today, because, I mean, literature in the 20th century, in many aspects, was a literature of emancipation, of liberation from something. And it seems that we have a society of very much liberated people who became very individualized, very individualistic, and thinking in the illusion that they can survive without other people. So this lack of feeling, of understanding of a very basic fact and very, very simple fact that we are so much dependent on others, and others can be having different religion, different ideology, different football clubs, but we are dependent on them. And for example, the war creates this understanding, because we might be talking about literature right now, but our lives depend on completely other people, people who down the drones over our heads, and people who go and repair our energy infrastructure after Russian strikes. And we have so many heroic stories, like those people who are in Kyiv, who were going in the freezing weather, in the freezing water, were repairing under the water things in the thermal power plant for 5 days, consecutive days. So I think it's remarkable how we are living in a time. So there was no epoch in human history where humans would be such dependent on each other, and countries, nations would be such dependent on each other. And at the same time, we had this illusion of individualism and economic autarchism and everything else. This kind of surprises me, because we can have food because of others, thanks to others. We have energy, heating, electricity because thanks to others. We have protection to thanks to others, and we still live in an illusion that we are kind of individuals whose task is to express themselves, and this idea of self-expression, which is the best, the biggest value of social networks. So I think this is what can literature do. Literature can bring us back to the understanding how linked we are and how we need each other. That would be my response.
Mhm. Thank you.
Okay, Florin, did you open your microphone? No. Florin Balotescu, can you help Florin Halalo? Maybe you can open his microphone. Florin, you can write. You can write on chat, in the chat
I'm
question.
afraid I cannot activate his microphone, but yeah, he could send a question in chat.
Let's wait. It's the last question, okay, Volodymyr, because you are already tired, I think. So Florin, if you can write, okay, he's writing the question in the chat.
Volodymyr cannot be tired. I'm pretty sure about this.
I'm sure he can be tired. So it's Florin, you are writing. Let's wait 1 minute to see. I don't know why his microphone it's not working. You touch a lot of topics and a lot of things, Volodymyr. Thank you very much. You answered to a lot of questions. Okay, now Florin wrote here. So the Russian minority changed their perspective since the war started?
It's a very good question, but first I would like to put a question: what the concept of Russian minority means, and whether we have such a concept. Because do we mean ethnic Russians? Do we mean Russian-speaking people? There are different groups. So you can have ethnic Russian who will speak Ukrainian. You can have ethnic Ukrainian who will speak Russian. You can have a mixture, a person with Ukrainian father, Russian mother, who will speak a mixture of the languages. We have the so-called Surzik who are the mixture. So it's not like, I don't know, we have kind of some ethnic homogeneous population and then we have some kind of minority. It's much more complicated. So being an ethnic Russian in Ukraine doesn't mean that you are pro-Russian and you are pro-Putin.
Mhm.
Being a Russian speaker in Ukraine doesn't mean that you are pro-Putin or pro-Russian. It's a very interesting thing that we need to understand, because in the Ukrainian history, of course, so there is one part of the story of Russian-Ukrainian relations, which is imperial part, that Russia wants to colonize Ukraine, and it started from the 17th century. Right? Before that, Ukrainian lands were more connected with the West, with the Lithuania, with Poland, and etc. So, but all this story from the 17th century up until 21st century is not only a story of, colonization, violent colonization. There are lots of violence, of course, but it's also a story that Ukrainians themselves, who are, by the way, calling themselves more Rusyny or Ruski, and calling Russians Moscovites. So Rus was a concept. Just to a brief history, Rus is the way how Finns were calling the Swedes, Ruotsi, and where the medieval Ukrainian state or Kiev state is one of those Viking states that were created by the Vikings in the 8th, 9th, 10th centuries all across Europe, right? So we know that. And Rus is that then was as a concept. So initially it was a concept that named the Scandinavian rulers of the Slavic people near Kiev, and then it was gradually kind of turned into a sacred concept, and then turned in. So it had a long history. So why I'm telling you that? because in part of Ukrainian history, you have this idea that, okay, but we have something in common with Moscow. Therefore, we need to be with Moscow. In the 17th century, it's mostly religion. It's orthodoxy. Why? Because 17th century is a century where Ukraine is under Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and we are in the epoch of Counter-Reformation. And Catholics across Europe are kind of quite expensive because they're going against Protestants, and in our part of the world, they're going against Orthodox. And Orthodox Eastern Christians needed to defend against them. And therefore, in this situation, they were looking at Moscow and say, well, this is our identity. We should go with them. So there's part of this as well. In the 19th century, you have the Slavophilic idea. Then you have socialist idea, because Ukrainian nation was mostly nation of peasants and workers, not aristocracy. And therefore, socialist ideas were very, very important for the creation of Ukrainian nation. Why I'm telling you this? Because now none of these elements works. So Orthodox, yeah, it's kind of a present in today's world, but not as a key factor. Pan-Slavism or Slavophilic ideas, certainly not. Socialist ideas, certainly not. Language remains the only thing. And therefore, Russians have put so much focus on language and saying we invade Ukraine to protect the Russian speakers, those who speak Russian. But the thing that you need to understand that there is no such a thing that Russian minority, like Russian ethnic minority. We have people who mostly speak Russian, people who mostly speak Ukrainian, people who mostly speak the mixture of the two. What we see after the 2022 is that the number of people speaking only Ukrainian increased. The number of people speaking both Ukrainian and Russian increased because some of them were speaking only Russian beforehand. But still, you can have a lot of people in Ukraine speaking Russian, and in our neighboring regions with Moldova and Romania, there are people who are speaking Romanian. There are people who are speaking Bulgarian. In Transcarpathia, there are people who are speaking Hungarian, etc.
Okay, Florin, do you have another question? Because I see the hand. No, it's okay. It's okay. There is another question or not?
Ruxandra, there is another question from Angela Fortuna in the chat.
Okay, I can't see it. I don't know. If you see it, read it, please.
So, do you have a project for the future for each of the alternatives? War won versus war lost? Or will the sign of uncertainty mark the coming decades and generations?
It's a very good question. So what I can definitely say about Russia, knowing Russian history, the only chance for Russia to change, to have a kind of democratization, is if Russia loses the war. And this is a very empirical observation because I judge on history. Let's have some examples. Take the wars that Russia won. They were bad for Russia. They led to the more authoritarianism in Russia. Take the Russian-Turkish wars. Okay, take the Great Northern Wars, Russia against the Swedes in the early 18th century. Peter I wins this war. It creates Russian Empire, also a very authoritarian state. Take the wars of Catherine II against the Turks. Catherine wins the war. It kind of consolidates the empire. Then Napoleonic Wars, Alexander I wins, and it kind of leads to the very authoritarian regime by Nicholas I. While Alexander I was kind of thinking more in the liberal terms after the French Revolution. Then, I don't know, take the Second World War, Soviet Union wins, and while, for example, in the Western Europe, like British Empire, Britain won the war, but because of the fact that it was democratic state, it won the Second World War, but it started to lose its empire, right? its victory in the war led to the de-imperialization of Britain, at least geopolitical. While in the Soviet Union, the victory in the war led to consolidation of empire. And if Stalin lived longer, it probably prolonged even longer. Only the death of Stalin led to a certain liberalization, but it didn't exist too much. Then take the wars that Russia lost. Crimean War in mid-19th century, Russia lost, and therefore it was forced to abolish slavery, abolish serfdom in 1861. Then it lost the Russian-Japanese War, and it created the conditions for the first Russian Revolution in 1905. Then it lost the First World War, and it created the conditions for the liberal revolution of the February 1917. I'm not talking about the Bolsheviks, but February 1917. When it lost the Afghan War, Afghanistan War, it led to collapse of the Soviet Union. So every time Russia won the war, it became more totalitarian, authoritarian. Every time it lost the war, and it lost many wars, it became there was window opportunity for certain democratization. This is about Russia. About Ukraine, well, it also depends what we call victory. For example, for some people, the fact that we have sovereignty and independence is already a victory. We lost territories, we are losing territories, but we are living in an independent country. Isn't it not a victory already? One can judge like that. I think the fact that we have now external enemy that consolidates Ukrainian society is an important factor. What will happen when there is no external enemy? Well, Ukrainian society can be very fragmented because we have internally lots of divisions, lots of traumas, lots of feeling of injustice, because the soldiers feel that they're treated with injustice compared to people in the rear, because they are always on the front, and people are in the rear, they're not on the front line, etc. There are many of these elements. So basically, we don't know, because contrary to Russia, we don't have this long history of Ukrainian statehood with which we could compare, right? But whether Ukrainian victory is still possible, that's a very good question. Who is more vulnerable right now, Russia or Ukraine? You can say, from looking at the freezing Ukrainians and and these bombardments, and that Ukraine is much more fragile than Russia. On the one hand, it's true. On the other hand, Russian economy is in a very bad shape. Russia is basically using its national reserves. If oil prices goes down and Russian economy is very non-diversified, if Europeans close the Baltic Sea, if there are more sanctions on Russian oil industry, we don't know who will collapse first. Ukrainians are now, I just had an interview for the podcast Explaining Ukraine, which will be published next week, and I really recommend, if you are interested, I have podcast more philosophical, Thinking in Dark Times. Both of them are in English, and more a political and cultural Explaining Ukraine. And one of my guests were saying, okay, but for the first time during the war, we have a parity in the means of destruction. Because if you look at the figures in 2022, Russians had 5 times more tanks than Ukraine, 10 times more airplanes. Ukrainians didn't have missiles at all. Russians have lots of missiles. They had the army 4 times larger, etc. Now we are in the technological war, where there is more or less parity. So we have more or less the same number of drones, for example. And Ukrainians have thousands of enterprises who are producing drones. So in this case, in this sense, this decentralized, a little bit anarchic nature of the Ukrainian economy created the response to that. And therefore, now the question is whether we have enough resources. And here is the question of Europe and other partners of Ukraine. But we are better off in terms of armaments, our own armaments, not only those armaments that we ask from our partners, but our own armaments. We are now better than we were in 4 years ago. And now the question is, who is now more efficient in this situation? Whether a country that is very decentralized and where the businesses, small businesses, produce a lot of things and who are very kind of flexible, or the highly centralized country that cannot invent anything. Russians who are mostly stealing Ukrainian technologies, but who can scale up. So Russians are better in scaling up. Take these drones, the Shahid drones. They took it from Iran and they just scale it up. So when you think about Ukraine, do not think only as a victim, as suffering, as people freezing. Think of it as a country that successfully resists, that is in some aspects stronger than it was in 2022, that is really defending Europe, because this is the war against the whole of Europe and the whole of the idea of republic or democracy. I think it's a war of new empires against the idea of democracy, and be engaged. That's what I will finish upon. Thank you.